record.
So, hello everyone, and welcome to Defense Policy and Potential Escalations. I'm here today with Dr. Julian Spencer-Churchill, or also known as Schofield. He conducts research in the field of security and strategic studies at the University of Concordia, which involves examining the power held by both states and non-state actors, as well as analyzing the factors that contribute to both conflict and peace. He has written about various topics across the globe, with the exception of Europe. His main research, part of that, he has written about various topics across the globe. His main research interests include the impact of arms races, the occurrence of war, the sharing of nuclear weapons, naval strategy, military planning, and doctrine. He has conducted field research in several countries, including the United States, Egypt, Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and more frequently, Pakistan, most frequently. In his teachings, he focuses on the topics such as strategic analysis, the acquisition and the use of nuclear weapons, the strategic studies of China, and the causes of conflict and peace. He employs quantitative methods such as operations research, statistics, and game theory in most of his courses. Prior to his academic career, he has served as an Army engineer officer from 1980s to the early 2000s. So with everything that's going on in today's world, it begs the question, when will the Russian-Ukrainian war end? How long will it take? And Dr. Churchill, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the PSGSA for their very kind invitation, in particular, because many of the MPPPA students that are members of the PSGSA end up holding key public service jobs in Ottawa for the Canadian government. And so I think it's very important that even though Canada is in many ways safely in North America, alliance politics are very important for Canada. And so Canadian public servants should definitely have opinions on what Canada should be doing internationally. So what I'd like to do today is answer the question, when will the Russo-Ukraine war end? And I'm doing what I think most scholars should do, which is revisit their earlier mistakes. So what I want to do is go back and look at an article I wrote over a year ago, which made incorrect predictions, and try to find out why I made those incorrect predictions and try to fix those predictions. So predicting when the Russian-Ukrainian war, which was initiated by Moscow's invasion on February 24th, 2023, will end is a puzzle, because the conflict's duration fits poorly with previous wars initiated by Russia. If we're looking at conflicts since Russia's defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of Leipzig in 1813. So in April of 2022, I wrote an article in Real Clear Defense entitled "The History of Russian Conflict Behavior Tells Us That the War in Ukraine Will Be Long," in which I argued that the war would end in one of two ways. Either a Russian victory, at which point it would end in 8 months, or as a defeat, at which point it would drag on for 16 months, concluding in approximately June of 2023, which is about a month and a half from this presentation. Neither outcome is likely. Well, certainly not the 8-month victory, given demonstrated levels of commitment by Moscow to hold on to its gains in the Donbass. I would like, consequently, to discuss the conceptual shortcomings of my earlier model and to propose a new set of variables to grapple with the problem of war termination in this case. So the history and pathology of Russia's wars over the last 2 centuries reveals that the current war in Ukraine may last significantly longer than a year, given the resources Moscow's mobilized for an attrition strategy against the Ukraine. An important historical observation is that Russia does not cut its losses, even when facing defeat, but gambles for strategic resurrection by committing to an attrition strategy to the very end. In the case of the war with Finland from 1939 to 1940, despite suffering 5 times the losses of their Finnish adversaries, Moscow doubled down and managed to negotiate a final settlement. Furthermore, there are 2 necessary conditions for Russia to achieve a victory in an attrition conflict. These are, first, a strong domestic stability and support for the war, and second, Moscow's success in isolating its adversary from international assistance. Neither of these conditions are met in the current war with Ukraine. The older Russian population has been mobilized by nationalism and is likely to maintain their support for the belligerents as long as it does not bear direct burden for the war, in terms of their family members not becoming battlefield casualties. The younger population, largely unenthusiastic about the war, have been atomized by the surveillance state and have offered little politically organized resistance. You can see here Daniil Orain, who runs a popular YouTube channel in which about 2/3 of the people he interviews in different cities in Russia, and he does these interviews about every 48 hours, clearly shows the apprehension the youth have, both about the Russian police state and about the ongoing war. Now, despite the threats of nuclear escalation, Moscow has been unable to deter Western material support to Ukraine, as it did, for example, during the 1956 invasion of Hungary. Now, since the defeat of Napoleon in 1816, there have been 95 wars between countries, of which 30 took place in Europe, of which Russia or the Soviet Union was involved in 10. Russia was involved in another 7 wars outside of Europe, including 3 against China, 3 against Japan, and 1 against Persia in the same period, meaning since 1816. Of the 10 European wars involving Russia, 2 were the First and Second World Wars, and 3 involved campaigns against Turkey, 1828 to 1829, 1877 to 1878, and the Crimean War from 1852 to 1856. Another 3 are post-revolutionary liberation movements against Russian occupation by Estonia from 1918 to 1920, Latvia from 1918 to 1919, and the Russo-Polish War from 1919 to 1920. The remaining 2 conflicts are the Russo-Finnish War of 1939 to 1940 and the Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956. The First World War also involved a Russian conflict with Turkey, and the Second World War involved a resumption of the Russian conflict with Poland and Finland. Russia was the initiator and the victor in both conflicts against Turkey, Finland in 1939 and Hungary in 1956. In the post-1918 revolutionary secessionist violence, the Soviet Union was the initiator but was defeated by Latvia, Estonia, and Poland. Russia was the target in both world wars and the Crimean War, but only victorious in the Second World War. In the 2 wars against the Ottoman Empire, Finland and Hungary, Russia isolated its target by diplomatically maneuvering to deter intervention or negotiate conditions for a limited war. The first Russo-Ottoman War, 1828 to 1829, was conducted by St. Petersburg in support of the Greek independence movement and in conjunction with British and French military allies. In the run-up to the Second Russo-Ottoman War, 1877 to 1878, Russia was able to take advantage of a weak Habsburg Empire, a France instigating revolts in the Ottoman Empire, and a collapse of Istanbul's holdings in the Balkans. Finland was isolated by Anglo-French and Third Reich appeasement of the Soviet Union during the lead-up to the Second World War. Hungary was invaded in 1956 behind a Soviet nuclear deterrent, and while the US was in a diplomatic standoff with the Anglo-French invasion of Egypt. When Russia initiated a conflict and lost, it was because it failed to stop foreign intervention, as in its defeat in the Crimean War, or because it initiated a conflict as a nascent Soviet Union and was poorly organized to suppress the separatists. The Crimean War started as a dispute between Russia and France over Christian subjects in the Ottoman Empire, with the English as mediators. British fears of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the subsequent Russian entry into the Eastern Mediterranean and threats to the Suez Canal led the English side to side with the French and the Ottomans. Russia's defeat by Latvia and Estonia was a function of British, French, and Polish support, and Poland's defeat of Russia was mostly due to Russian weakness, despite the presence of a French trading mission, which wasn't vitally important in giving the Poles victory. Now, a key formula for Russian victory, therefore, is to initiate a war without triggering a counterbalancing reaction by its neighbors, and to plan operations at a time when it is not suffering from domestic instability. When either of these conditions is unmet, Russia has been defeated by a better organized or allied equipped adversary. Russia's current war in Ukraine is characterized by precisely these two shortcomings. Russian President Vladimir Putin's pre-war confrontations and compellant signaling has primed Western democratic publics to provide strong moral and material support to Ukraine, as well as drawing the expansion of NATO eastward. His aggressively confrontational bid also galvanized Ukrainian identity, which has had a telling impact in the cohesiveness and combat performance of the Ukrainian armed forces. Now, aside from both world wars and the war in Crimea, all of which lasted over 2 years, the duration of wars in which Russia was victorious were 17 months and 9 months respectively against the Ottoman Empire, 4 months against Finland, and 5 days against Hungary, for an average of 8 months. Russia's defeats against Latvia, Estonia, and Poland last an average of 16 months, or twice as long. Even in conflicts Russia is set on losing, its significant internal resources means that the strategies of attrition it usually relies on can be extended for over a year. The implication is that as long as Russia can secure energy markets outside the Western democracies, Moscow can obtain the capital to continue to pay for the conflict, which Ukraine is less well endowed to fund without significant foreign aid. Now, with regard to battlefield fatalities, Russia suffered greater losses than its opponents in both victory and defeat, except against the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, where it suffered about 2/3 as much. Its loss ratio varied between 1.5 to 1 in its war against Poland to as high as 2 to 1 against Estonia, and an extreme ratio of 5 to 1 against Finland. These losses, in conjunction with the historical length of Russian wars, indicate that the Russo-Ukrainian conflict may endure for longer than a year and incur considerable casualties and material damage on Ukraine. Now, many of these key factors were replicated in Russia's Asian campaigns. Russia was the target of attack by a British-backed Persia in 1826, which, however, had overreached and was defeated in a 20-month campaign by Moscow. Russia's two initiated conflicts were against China. Both resulted in victories due to the relative isolation of Peking. This included a 3-month conflict in 1900 and a 4-month-long conflict in 1929. Russia was defeated by Japan over a 1-month clash at Changkufeng in 1938, and then inflicted a costly stalemate on Japan over 4 months at Nomonhan in 1939, both instances in which Japan was the initiator. Russia's severe defeat in the 11th month 1904-1905 Russo-Japanese War was primarily a function of its strategic isolation by British maritime diplomacy, but amplified by domestic instability that undermined the Russian war effort. Russia's defeat of China during the Boxer Rebellion in 1900 and the Soviet Union's destruction of the Japanese Manchurian Army in 1945 were both campaigns conducted while Russia was embedded in a broad coalition, where Russia is able to isolate an opponent. Even when it is not the conflict initiator, it is typically capable of prevailing, if not achieving victory. There are therefore 3 Western takeaways from Russia's pathology of war. First, Russia is a very conservative war initiator, which means it was eminently deterrable in January and February of 2022 from invading Ukraine. Western intransigence, the lack of political will and foresight among democratic politicians in the West, and German and Western European concern about domestic political shocks due to energy dependence on Russia created this policy of weakness. The lesson here is that once the war ends in the Ukraine, and it will end as all wars do, a policy of deterrence is easily achievable by NATO. Second, Western supporters of Ukraine must prepare for an extended conflict and ensure the fiscal sustainability of their military assistance without running down their own war stocks. Third, NATO must signal a cohesive and credible nuclear deterrent to counter what will become a more desperate Russian attempt to isolate Ukraine by brandishing the threat of nuclear escalation. So this concludes the content of that article, which I got wrong, written in April of 2022. Now, the assumption of using past conflicts to project future conflict was based on the constants of geographic distance and the terrain's impact on combat, and projecting the political expectations in Moscow about war duration, and how all of these would combine to affect Russian calculations. Consequently, creating new analogies off of longer Russian wars, such as the 3-year participation in the Crimean War or the First World War, or the 4-year participation of Moscow in the Second World War, is less useful than having more explicit identification of variables that influence the outcome. So rather than just list other wars, I'm going to get into the variables, something I should have done explicitly in this first variable, in the first article. So variable number 1, Ukraine's commitment to continued resistance. Now, this is high, and it's driven as much by a similar culture of self-defense as the Russians, given Ukraine's lack of defensible frontiers, just like the Russians. It's also motivated by the Ukrainian fear of Russia's brutal methods in war and in occupation. Ukraine, now 14 months into the conflict, shows no evidence of wavering, indicated by such indicators as low rates of desertion, surrendering, collaboration, or routing in battle. Emboldened by Western aid and by the fact that Ukraine has not yet fully mobilized its manpower, and by Russian attacks on the Ukrainian civilian population, which is a reminder of Russia's hostility to Ukrainian interests, this variable is unlikely to change for 4 years or more. For this analysis, the high levels of motivation demonstrated by the Ukrainians can be taken as a constant. In other words, Russia is going to give up before Ukraine does. Now, the resistance of South Koreans during the Korean War and the South Vietnamese after the departure of the US from Vietnam in 1972, for nearly 4 years, indicates that populations are willing to commit if they agree with their political leaders about the definition of a clear threat. Carter Malkasian, an author of many works on attrition, has demonstrated that political victory can be achieved even in a war of attrition if there's a sustainable and punishing loss ratio inflicted on the enemy. The Iran-Iraq War persisted for 8 years in the 1980s before it was terminated by dramatic territorial changes inflicted by the Iraqi army on the Iranians. However, while successively successful Ukrainian counteroffensives and maneuvers may capture territory, they will never compel Russia to terminate the war, unless Ukraine can provoke a youth revolt in Russia. The second variable, the sustainability of consistent Western economic and military support to Ukraine, is complicated by differing interests in the Western alliance. The strongest supporters are frontline countries that are concerned by Russian military threats to their territories, like Poland, Slovakia, the Baltic states, and Finland, and particularly those states with a significant Russian minority population, such as Estonia. Even states that are seeking independent foreign policies, like Turkey, France, and Hungary, provide economic and military assistance to Ukraine, as do states that are dependent on imported Russian energy, like Germany and Italy. The US interest in particular, as the largest contributor to NATO, is to address the Russian threat in the near term, so that Moscow cannot ally with China in the future and distract a US defense of Taiwan. As with Iraq's August 1990 invasion of Kuwait, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has provided the US with an opportunity to inflict considerable attrition on Russia's armed forces, while also justifying the global sanctions to exploit the possibility of a liberalizing regime change in Moscow. China is far less likely to attack Taiwan if it is diplomatically and strategically isolated. Bipartisan support in Washington for continued financial armaments assistance to Ukraine remains strong, given that disbursements are still a single-digit percentage of the amount spent on operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. US support would drop if Russia indicated it would escalate to weapons of mass destruction to defend Crimea and the Donetsk and Luhansk republics. although Washington may still encourage Ukrainian resistance if it's believed that regime change was still attainable. Variable 3. Like many aggressors against US interests, such as Baghdad, Tripoli, or Kabul, authoritarian states like Russia have poorly formulated foreign policies that are self-isolating. Saddam Hussein's Iraq, for example, had already alienated the USSR in its 1979 border conflict with Syria. Libya's Muammar Gaddafi had likewise alienated his country from like-minded socialist Arab states and the Soviet Union, and even its main oil customers, such as Italy, in Europe. In the case of the Kremlin, this is in part because President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, has no corporate base seeking survival. Rather, he's the leader of a single faction, conveniently log rolling on the global trading power for finances between his Siloviki supporters, basically legacy members of the KGB, and the oligarchs that produce wealth within Russia. In contrast, the Soviet Communist Party, whose payoffs included both institutional perks for its members, as well as ideological goals for those that wanted to serve the Soviet Union, acted as an organization that members could rally around. Without rules of succession, Vladimir Putin's Kremlin has the short-term political vision of a democracy. Now, for a democracy, short-term goals are an advantage because it allows for rapid policy shifts in response to challenges in the international system, as well as a regular reaffirmation that the party in power is pursuing the public's conception of the national interest. But for authoritarian Russia, the fixation on short-term goals means that its foreign policy horizon is much shorter than that of a democracy, which can more easily establish long-term agreements and alliances with other countries. Russia's inability to commit to diplomatic agreements means that it cannot rally other states unless those states are already hostile to the US. Russia's only allies are therefore weapons providers, like Iran. China, fearful that it'll be chain ganged, in other words, dragged into a conflict with Russia against the West, given Beijing's focus on its domestic stability, is reluctant to enter into an agreement with Moscow. Beijing's peace overtures in April of 2023 are at best an instrument of distraction in the event Beijing moves against Taiwan. In this event, this variable is a constant that predicts that Russia will not benefit from an increase in material advantage over time, either in the form of trade or weapons obtained through its allies. Variable 4. The key variable of war duration is the conflict's impact on Russia's under 35 population. Vladimir Putin has a persistent 70% political support, but this support is soft and will drop to a third if youth from Russia's European metropolises begin suffering significant battlefield losses. As of April 2023, the rate of battlefield casualties from Moscow is less than 3 per 100,000, as compared with much higher values drawn from rural Russia and ethnic minority communities. Mass recruitment of youth will lead to passive resistance during training and deployment, and mass desertions and mutinies for troops that are rotated out of the front line. These losses, as well as imposing a police state in anticipation of these reactions, will further alienate the older cohort, typically the parents of these under 35 cohort. And this brings us to our last variable, variable 5. The Ukrainian campaign season is the summer, and this timing will determine when Russia's political elite gambles on youth recruitment. Given concerns in the Kremlin about a military revolt led by an under 35 cohort, they are likely to see continued attrition in the summer of 2023 with available forces. There may be a call-up of 1 million under 35s in the fall of 2023, most likely resulting from a successful Ukrainian counteroffensive, but it will likely be advertised as excluding service within the Ukraine. This will lead to the deployment of the under 35s in the campaign season of the summer of 2024, which is over a year from now, by which time a revolt will likely take place by the fall of 2024 and political unrest in the spring of 2025. So the first 4 variables are constants. They basically describe potentials that are not realized at Moscow. The variable that explain change, political change within Moscow, is the 5th variable, which is a function of the campaign season. So there's a joint causation between the recruitment of the under 35 cohort, which may occur, may be stimulated by Ukrainian counteroffensive, in conjunction with Moscow's decision of when to conduct a campaign, which typically will coincide with the summer campaigning season. And the intersection of these 2 variables indicates that in summer of 2024, you're going to see a stimulating effect on the under 35 cohort. They will politically coalesce in the fall of 2024, and this will create political problems for Moscow, which can be resolved in a number of ways, either by public demonstrations or a palace coup or military intervention in the spring of 2025. So thank you for listening to the talk, and I'm very interested in listening to your counterpoints and your questions.
Thank you, Professor. So we'll start off with our attendees. If anybody has a particular question, just raise your hand. Yes, Houston, go ahead.
Cool. I find your analysis very interesting, and I really appreciate the willingness to sort of look at previous work and sort of understand why things didn't work and what the other information that you get in subsequent months. But I was wondering if you had considered in your analysis the lack of materials of war that Russia is currently suffering. So based on what I've heard through journalist articles and military reports, Russia is currently lacking in the advanced materials of war that the Ukraine is being supplied by the Western allies, and they're actually digging into their older and older reserves. And part of the problem with that is that their munitions are actually not, they lack the proper munitions for the materials of war, which is why they're currently using large-scale artillery as opposed to precision weapons. And part of the problem with that is that the Russian method right now is eating up even the extensive reserves that they have from the Cold War, which are actually lower than we would expect because of, I guess, combination of corruption and poor storage, I guess, is part of the issue. Have you considered this factor in their capacity to continue the war, even in a defensive manner, as they currently are?
Yeah, that's a very. Of course, I'm going to answer your question, and I'd like you to answer and give us your perception, obviously, after I answer. On the very last point about the poor storage, if you go to Zhukovsky on a map, which is a Russian airbase, during the Cold War, it was a secret airbase, which is located east of Moscow, you're going to see an airfield with experimental aircraft that are similar to Area 51 in the US. And whereas in the US, you have large hangars storing the very expensive aircraft, so they're not visible to satellites. In Zhukovsky at the airfield, you'll see interesting aircraft with forward swept wings simply parked underneath trees on the side of the airfield. And this is visible from Google Earth. So very, very important points that you raised, Houston. First issue is I don't want us to exaggerate the amount of material that the Ukrainians are getting. They're getting 230 tanks, which is essentially sufficient for a division minus, sort of a two armored brigade division. And so you're looking at 15,000 soldiers. And Ukrainians have probably about 300,000 soldiers mobilized, and the Russians are closer to 400,000. So you're looking at less than 10% of the Ukrainian army that's mobilized in one force. And that force would, aside from handfuls of tanks, you're looking at a company of Leopard 2 tanks, for example, which is essentially 20-ish tanks, really not a lot. And so it's sort of you've got a one-punch organization that's going to attack and probably going to lose half their tanks. The rate of attrition in tanks, according to the Dupuy Institute, is 5 times the rate of personnel attrition. So you're going to look at a 3% per day attrition in personnel and a 15% rate of attrition in the tanks. So this force is going to run out of tanks in 6-7 days a week. And the tanks are not counted as destroyed. It means there's be a lot of maintenance. So Ukraine does not have a huge material advantage over the Russians. Russian expenditures are actually associated with a coup-proofed Russian military that's under very tight political control by the cronies of Putin. So whereas in the Russo-Finnish War of 1939-1940, you had 4 months of defeat, and then Stalin, the Soviet leader, called the generals back and gave them a combination of more planning freedom, but also selected out some poor leaders. And so we have paradoxically efficient military planning under communist guidance. The Soviet army was able to reorganize itself and then go for a second push, which ultimately won. What I think is happening now in Russia is that the KGB gangsters, the Siloviki operating around Putin, still have not given the military the freedom to plan to fight the way they want to. So you're quite right. The Russians are blazing through enormous amounts of equipment instead of imposing the kind of training necessary to win, which they're definitely capable of. But Putin, of course, does not want the military to have that freedom, because the same freedom that allows the military to plan, which means the military would be able to realize their own corporate interest, would give that organization the freedom to knock Putin out of power. Putin's primary goal is to neutralize the army at all costs, because they're the only institution that will throw him out of power. So if we're talking specifically about equipment, you're quite right. I mean, Russia's running out of equipment. They've essentially run out of stocks of precision-guided weapons. And they did that about a year ago. And I wrote 4 articles on it, essentially encouraging the Ukrainians not to protect their cities, because the Ukrainians should want to have had, they should have wanted to use their cities as magnets for all those Russian missiles. And it worked. The Russians have used up most of their missiles. Now they're turning their S-300 interceptor rockets into surface-to-surface and air-to-surface rockets, which are incredibly expensive, kill very few people. Now, we don't want to exaggerate precision-guided weapons. Stephen Biddle at the Institute of Defense Analysis published his analysis on the ground of the US Air Force's operations against NATO operations against Serbian ground targets. And it was found that NATO bombed Serbian targets 3 or 4 times. The Serbians would create decoys in the form of tanks, repaint them after each strike, and then put them in a separate location. And then they become a new target. So this extends also to Ukrainian precision weapons. Without the intelligence system to target, to identify targets, Ukrainian and Russian precision weapons are going to be very wasteful. But the implication there is the most efficient arm for destruction is the artillery. And the artillery, it kills a lot less than small arms or heavy machine guns or the cannon of a tank. But it does account net-wise for the largest number of injured casualties. And it's far more efficient with a forward controller than all of these standoff air-launched rockets that are at great distance, which is what Russia's running out of. So Russia still has a lot of artillery. It's reduced the amount of artillery it's firing significantly just because it's running out. But the amount of artillery, the amount of tanks, the amount of helicopters and aircraft that are still retained by the Russian armed forces would still make for an effective fighting force if the Russian corporate interest was allowed to express itself. And that could still happen. The army could simply go to Putin and say, we are losing because of you. Either give us freedom or we'll knock you out of power. That's a big if. I mean, frankly, that wouldn't be done by the under 35 cohort. That would be done by the over 35 cohort. But for some reason, the military has not realized their corporate interest yet and intervene. Consequently, I don't think the lack of weapons is a major issue for the Russians. The main variable here is just military incompetence encouraged by the KGB supervision, the ex-KGB supervision of the armed forces. My final point is many of NATO's weapons don't have a huge advantage over Russian weapons. If you're looking at engagements of 1,500 meters or less, which is the average engagement range you're going to find in even flat Ukraine, right, which is sort of the bounding between tree lines and between rises in the terrain formed by roads or rail lines, the penetration of a NATO tank at that range is very similar to the penetration of a former Soviet tank. The difference for NATO tanks is at much greater ranges, which is what you're going to see if you're fighting over the desert, or if you have an armored vehicle on top of a rise, and it's able to see a great distance and fire hull down. Then you're looking at 3,000 meters, 4,000 meters, and their NATO tanks definitely have an advantage. But most of the engagements, if you're looking at tanks with guns better than a T-62, so we're looking at a 120 millimeter or 125 millimeter or more for the former Soviet tanks, I don't think you're going to have a huge advantage for a Leopard. A Leopard's treads are as exposed to immobilization as a T-64 or a T-62. So you're quite right about the weapons running out, but there are still 8,000 S-300s, and so that's at the current rate of use. The Russians have several years worth of that. But whether or not they use them precision-wise, I don't think it's going to have a huge impact on the war. The war will be determined by infantry with armor and artillery on the ground. And Russia could use up 90% of their stocks. And if they have a late game revival in their military training, they'll become efficient even with a very small amount of stocks. Because when the Russians are down to 10%, they're going to have the same amount of equipment as the Ukrainians. Now, the reason the Russians could realize the same level of combat motivation as the Ukrainians would be if they're defending the built-up areas in Crimea, because there's overwhelming support there for the Russian presence. And frankly, the Luhansk and Donetsk, on the principle of self-determination, the Russians will simply be more highly motivated to protect their territory than the Ukrainians will be to take it back. So my inclination is there. The impact of self-determination as a motive right now favors the Ukrainians. But once southern Ukraine and Mariupol and those areas are recaptured, I predict that advantage will shift to the Russians, and it might stimulate the Russian military rediscovering their corporate interests. So what do you think? If you could put a timeline on weapons, of course we're speculating here, and how do you think it plays in as a factor?
Not to make this too much of a military sort of jargon debate, but I do think that the emphasis on the tanks might be overplaced. Like, everybody keeps talking about the tanks, but the Ukrainians have shown that they can actually advance quite a lot without significant heavy armor. So that might be an overstatement of the utility of tank warfare in the modern age, in my opinion. But at the same time, I take the point that they still have their stocks. They still have quite a bit left over. I would suggest that my issue is, I guess what you're saying is that their stocks will last them several years at this point, in your opinion. And something else is going to happen before that ends up happening, right? So I take that point and I take it well. At the same time, I would say that your assessment on the Crimea might be correct. At the same time, with significant losses, and the fact that Russia isn't what it used to be is kind of my overall point in this. It's not this gigantic superpower of size and scale that it was in the early 20th century. It is a significantly smaller nation. Ukraine is 1/3 the size and population of Russia, which is smaller, but Finland was able to fight them off with a minuscule version of that. So, and considering that the combined production and wealth and power of the West backing Ukraine significantly outweighs anything Russia can bring to the table, and the fact that much of the Russian population is actually elderly, and they're currently running through the young population that exists in the rural areas and in the minorities as well. All of that suggests to me that either there's going to be some sort of like minority revolt in some of the regions. Chechnya might be a good candidate for that happening. Some of the other regions like Tatarstan might be another area where you might see some civil protests show up in the pretty soon if news breaks out that they have lost another cohort of their young men. All of that seems to be where this is heading more than anything else. I would suggest that the wars to look at right now are 1905 and 1916-17, honestly, because if we're using historical examples, I think just in terms of the pattern, not necessarily the pattern of war, but the pattern of social upheaval in Russia is useful to look at, because there was significant support for those wars at the very beginning for the first year or two, but when the population is losing and they're not fighting over their core territory, at least as they perceive it to be, well, actually, even the First World War, they were fighting for what they saw as their core empire. Like when the Russians surrendered, the Germans, well, at least when the Soviet Union surrendered, they were surrendering what they viewed as core territory, simply because they could not continue fighting. So I think that might be a more predictable outcome. Now, that might be a little bit optimistic from a Western viewpoint, but that's where my head is at the moment, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely something that needs to be considered. I think it is a factor in decision making in Moscow. I wrote an article again way back in, shortly after the war started, looking at the breakup of. In fact, I believe I wrote a preliminary article even before the war broke out, because I had experienced a discussion in the mid '80s with a colleague. I visited the Soviet Union, and I came to the conclusion that it would collapse at some point. And I was amazed at the lack of discussion in Western scholarship on what they thought the West's foreign policy should be on the breakup of the USSR, and there simply wasn't any. So it came as a surprise. So in my article, I explored some of the breakaways that you identified. I don't think Yakutia in the Far East, you have 1 million people, and they've got their capital in Yakutsk. It's a very low per capita income. They're very widely dispersed, and they're couched behind a larger Russian population. So I really don't think they're a candidate for secession, in part because Russia's second largest unexplored oil fields are there. And so there'd be a very strong incentive for them to hang on. And there are more Russians in and around Irkutsk than there are in all of Yakutia, which is to the north of it. So they're on the interior, in effect, of Russia, or to the north. So they all of their infrastructure for trade goes through the south. And so they'd be easily isolated. And the Russians would simply cut off the rail lines, and then Yakutia would have to submit if it was a sort of a provincial revolt. In terms of Tatarstan, I don't think independence is feasible, because even though their population numbers in the millions, they're actually in the interior of the Russian population. And so they're completely surrounded. And so like Yakutia, they could be isolated. Definitely for Dagestan and for Chechnya, it's a very likelihood that they could secede with support from Turkey or Iran. So they're candidates. But of course, they're much closer to Russia proper, so military intervention would be quite easy, and they're quite small. And there are significant divisions within those societies that can be exploited, which is what you're seeing now with how the Russians dominate Dagestan. So I think the points you raised are important, but I don't think there's going to be an ethnic revolt. I think those communities are just too disadvantaged, both geographically and demographically, to matter. So in the same way that you're not going to get a Tibetan breakaway from China if there's regime change in Beijing, I don't think it'll happen with Russia. But Houston, very, very good points. So are there any other questions?
All right. We got, go ahead. Oh, that was a clap. All right. And then Sophia, you want to go? Abel? All right.
Yeah, Professor. Just a quick question. I was wondering, what is your opinion regarding the use of nuclear weapons or even tactical weapons in the war? What are the possibilities of that happening? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I wrote several articles on that in the past, and I was ultimately going to write up how the Russians would use it by going through all of my Soviet material. And I quickly discovered that given the Russian performance, given the heavy emphasis the Soviets had on the use of tactical nuclear weapons and theater nuclear weapons, and given how the Soviet military was designed primarily for a nuclear-supported conventional offensive towards the Ruhr Valley, and towards the Persian Gulf and towards Beijing during the Cold War, I concluded that it's completely pointless studying Soviet tactical nuclear warfare operations because the Russians have forgotten it. So how would someone in political charge like Vladimir Putin direct the use of nuclear weapons? Now, I think Putin's thinking about his ability to survive politically once he's out of power, and therefore the legacy he leaves is very important. So he wants to be a builder, and he doesn't want to be like Mikhail Gorbachev, which is a destroyer or a breaker down of Russian territories. In Putin's imagination, I believe he believes that most Russians would not forgive him if he gave up the Crimea. Now, the Crimea is shared by many different people. You have Tatars there that are not necessarily pro-Russian, but the majority of the population in Crimea is more supportive of Moscow's control than they are of Kiev's control. But there is a general consensus among both Ukrainians and Russians that it should be held as Slavic territory and not revert to what it was before, which is basically either Turkish or an independent Tatar homeland. This means that Putin will fight, I believe, with nuclear weapons, not necessarily if the Ukrainians get into Crimea, because the northern part of Crimea is fluid. But when you get to Sevastopol, or to cities that are north of it or to the east of it that are couched in the mountains, you'll see the Russians taking a hard stand. And if Ukraine is able to break into those mountains, I could see Putin detonating a nuclear weapon in or near Crimea as a signal that he's not going to give up that territory, and he would do it with the support of the Russian people. Now, the West has not aggressively counseled Ukraine not to go for Crimea just because it's useful to keep the war going, right? The Ukraine will not fight if they think recapturing the Donbass and Crimea are hopeless, and so the West humors Ukraine. But I think it's a red line that the West recognizes. So I think under those circumstances, they'll use a nuclear weapon. They might use it for Luhansk and Donetsk, but frankly, I don't think the Ukrainians will be able to push very far into those territories because the people there are motivated. The principle of self-determination will give them a much higher level of motivation. And if you look at where the Ukrainians are pushing back, they're not pushing anywhere near the Luhansk and Donetsk regions because they would inherit a large population that they would then have to administer. And while Ukraine does have semi-authoritarian elements to its governance, particularly in the way that it enforces cultural policy, the use of Ukrainian language in media, on radio and TV, I don't think a more liberal Ukraine, which is what the West is pushing Ukraine to become with their anti-corruption drives as a condition for foreign aid, I don't think Ukraine will preserve those instruments of power that'll enable it to rule the Donbass against the interests of the local Russians. So I think long before nuclear weapons would be used in the Donbass. Now, how nuclear weapons would be used would be very crude. The Soviet technique is to strike at targets, enabling rapid maneuver. The Russians are not capable of anything but the simplest uncoordinated, meaning uncoordinated by artillery and air power type of maneuver. So it'd be a sort of a World War I maneuver where you drop a bomb on a concentrated target and then you march onto and then through the target. As opposed to the Soviet technique, which would be just continuous high speed, 30 to 40 kilometers an hour, constant movement of multiple echelons advancing through each other as they're worn down by attrition, rapidly changing direction to avoid a NATO counter-nuclear strike, enabled by gas strikes, infantry, armored artillery, rapid movement, and striking these hardened targets, particularly in urban areas where NATO can find refuge and then sort of leap out. The Russians are not going to be able to do that at all. It's going to be very, very static type of advance. They're going to hit a target and then move over to it, hit a target and then move over to it. And politically, you'll never get those multiple relays because I think NATO is going to retaliate either conventionally, severely against ships in the Black Sea. If Russia does multiple nuclear strikes, I could see NATO go against Russian allies like Belarus and Iran. So that countries that are helping, it would be a signal to countries that the US is not going to strike with NATO weapons against Russia proper, because that would be a rapid escalation. But it would quickly destroy Russian allies. And Russia could then strike non-NATO allies. But there aren't, I mean, frankly, there are not a lot of non-NATO allies available that don't have some independent capacity for striking back with nuclear weapons, that don't already have a US nuclear guarantee. So Russia would be trapped. So that's my guesstimate. NATO does not want to use nuclear weapons, not because nuclear weapons are not effective, they're very effective. The problem is US deterrence is based on the calculus that nuclear weapons are easy to use, and the US maintains its power by making sure other countries don't see that they're easy to use. Because if other countries could see how easy they were to use, how effective they were, and how cheap they were, everyone would be buying them. And this would, A, reduce US power and their capability to intervene. And secondly, it would make the world a very dangerous place. The US grand strategy right now is to spread democracy faster than the proliferation of nuclear weapons, which, if we look at the AQ Khan episode of nuclear proliferation, all of the materials necessary to build an atomic bomb are no longer need to be stolen or scrounged from the West. They're now available in developing countries or middle-income countries like Turkey and Malaysia. And so the US is trying not to stimulate those countries from discovering how easy it is to build nuclear weapons. The US doesn't want to use, it desperately doesn't want to use nuclear weapons, and the Russians might exploit it, but it's far more likely we're going to look at a very, very clumsy sort of attritional use of nuclear dropped bombs, which is nevertheless very, very dangerous. But I think it's fairly easy to predict where the Russians are going to use those nuclear weapons. So a very good question. What do you think, Abel?
Not, my opinion is not as detailed as yours, obviously, but it's just maybe it was a simple assertion that if the Russians start losing very badly and it becomes something of an existential threat, then maybe then they'll use nuclear weapons. It's only logical to me. Then yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yeah, no, I think you're quite right on the definition of what the Russians think is an existential threat. I think the way the U.S. is corralling the Ukrainian war effort, it's I hate to use metaphors, but it's like the frog in the frying pan, right? You put a frog in a frying pan, you slowly increase the temperature of the frog because its nervous system doesn't see a jump in heat; it just sees a slight increase in heat. I don't know if this is even biologically true, but it's said that the frog does not leap out; it simply cooks and dies. So what they're trying to do is get Putin to feel normalized, and then to get him gradually used to the exposure to violence, and then he doesn't see a sudden shock, and then a need to use a nuclear weapon. And this is sort of like what happened during the Korean War. The Chinese did this to the Americans. They got them into a war, and they got the Americans into a long war. And under the Truman administration in the U.S. was reluctant to use nuclear weapons. And so the war just dragged on, and the Chinese could have kept the war going on for a very long time until Eisenhower came in, U.S. president, said, listen, we've got to end this thing. And he implicitly threatened to escalate with nuclear weapons, and then China started to negotiate in earnest to end the conflict. So what's going on in Ukraine is a controlled, slow, gradual, incremental escalation, so that the Russians never feel it's an existential crisis. It's simply cumulative losses over a long time that becomes normalized even in the Russian population. And so Putin is not going to be punished for these increased losses. Consequently, if you look at wars like the Vietnam War, the losses don't have a direct impact. The accumulation of losses does not have a direct impact on support for the war. It's the logarithm of the losses. In other words, you have to have a significant acceleration of losses to have a political impact on the war, meaning you have to multiply the losses by 10 within a given time period to actually cause people to not support the war. Because once you have a certain number of losses, doubling the losses doesn't have that much of a political significance. And the people are already committed to winning. It's a sunk loss fallacy. I've lost X number of friends and relatives. I want revenge. So they're going to commit to the war, hoping that they could recoup the losses in the form of some satisfaction for revenge on the target state. And so Putin is being maneuvered into that situation where his own population want the war to continue to get revenge on the children that they've lost, right? But of course, we know in reality, desires for revenge in war are never ever satisfied. It's impossible, right? The state that you defeat never has enough money to pay the reparations, and the people that lose their sons and daughters in wars are never the beneficiaries of these reparation payments. So thank you, Abel. I see two other hands. Houston, can I go on to Yeha?
Of course.
So Yeha, would you like to try to answer my question?
Actually, I had another question. So my question is, is the Iranian drone Shahed 136 a game changer for the war? And also, if Russia utilized it since the beginning of the war, do you think the outcome would have been different right now?
Well, I'm gonna restate. I said on one of my YouTube channel lectures that I posted that drone warfare is exaggerated, and someone came along after the war started and said, "Ah, you're wrong." I'm still standing by it. Drone warfare is interesting and beautiful because you have something that you can show a picture of for journalists. But I actually don't think it makes that much of a difference. There are easy countermeasures for the inexpensive drones. And I think what we want to do is when the war is over, tally up the total source of losses. Now, typically in warfare, most of the losses are going to be in the form of fragmentation from artillery, about 50%. Artillery is going to kill about 10% of the time and injure 90%. Small arms are going to kill this is from the Dupuy Institute calculations since Napoleon, right? They looked at all the battles and looked at the different distributions. Small arms are going to kill more often, like a Kusurov machine gun is going to kill more often. I would speculate that drones injure less, much less than mortars. Drones are very expensive. They're certainly useful against armored vehicles like very expensive surface-to-air systems for hitting aircraft at much higher altitudes. In that sense, they're very, very cost-effective. Now, I think they're a game changer, like a confrontation between any two uneven powers, which is what we saw Azerbaijan against Armenia. But I think the key impact of drones in the war against Russian targets in Ukraine is drones in conjunction with other forms of intelligence gathering. So a drone is going to go into an area, it's going to spot a target. That target then has to be put through the intelligence system and confirmed and corroborated by electronic intelligence or other forms of surveillance before it can become a valid target. Because camouflage is very easy because leaves carry water, and water inhibits the propagation of radar waves and other forms of remote sensing, including infrared. So drones are visual. It's basically as useful as taking a person and sticking him in a balloon, which is what Napoleon did at the siege of Mantua in Italy at the end of the 18th century. It's a heck of a lot more useful to have a guy in a balloon than a guy in a tree, no question. But I think a lot of these drones, especially the ones that the Russians have been wasting on the electrical grid in Ukraine, are just incredibly wasteful. If you blow up an electrical grid, it's primarily affecting those people that already don't like Russia, so it has no impact on combat motivation. Because industry that's building weapons was prioritized over residential areas, it has no effect on the creation of weapons for war. And it's not hitting military targets. So in general, the whole drone effort by the Russians was a ginormous waste of money, which indicates, which is very common, for political leaders to imagine attacking civilians as some sort of political strategy. Bombing never wins. And there's a famous book by Pape, which is Bombing to Win, and which he concludes, in the history of warfare, bombing has never, ever produced an independent political outcome unless a country decided before the bombing began to do something. So the Hungarians, before they were bombed by the Americans in World War II, already made a secret arrangement where they wouldn't shoot past the American bombers in exchange for not getting bombed. And that was because Hungarians were not that enthusiastically support of Nazism and of the Third Reich's war effort against the Soviet Union. But frankly, that may be the majority of cases. But in countries that are already involved in war, they've already incorporated that calculation. So the drone effects on Ukraine, targeting civilians, colossal waste of money, horribly tragic. Not for the Ukrainians. I mean, Ukrainians, they laughed all the way to the bank. The Russians wasted something that could have given them a tactical advantage. On the battlefield, intelligence is fleeting. When you spot a target, you got to make sure it's not a decoy. And then that decoy is going to be moved. So you've got a short amount of time to put that thing on a target. So a well-executed use of drones, definitely a big force multiplier, because it allows you to peel away at the enemy's air defense against the most powerful forms of artillery, striking headquarters. But successfully striking against air defense systems is going to be rare. Successfully striking against a headquarters, very rare, because you're going to be dealing with parallel headquarters units that are set up with their own electronic signature to create a distraction for the correct target identification. So if I had to put a number on it, I would say that drones had a single-digit percentage impact on increasing the combat efficiency of, and that's still significant. And as an Army engineer, I wouldn't say the engineers add more than 10 or 15%. But we build mines, and minefields don't kill people. They basically channel military forces to expose a flank or to go into a kill zone. So we work in conjunction with others. Our 10% kill or 7% kill added to artillery could double to 20% if someone's stupid enough to go into a kill zone they're not supposed to be in. So I think drones have that multiplier effect. But my test for everything is the Americans had a huge number of drones during the Vietnam War to dupe North Vietnamese air defense. Could any technology, including the very intelligent drones we have today, if the Americans had them in the late 60s and early 70s, would the outcome have been different in Vietnam? And my thinking is no. So it's not a miracle weapon, right? And if you don't have a political plan, which the Americans lacked in Vietnam, they would still lose. Or you can ask the same question in Afghanistan. The Americans would still have lost. So that's my quantification. Do you agree with me, Yeha?
Well, in some degree, yes, because like you said, targeting the civilian infrastructures would be a waste of money. Because I thought maybe when a war occurs, the first thing that gets struck is usually our airports, electricity infrastructures and water power plants and that kind of stuff. But I was surprised to see that they didn't strike those, they didn't destroy those, and instead they decided to do it with the drones. So I was like, are they what's the main purpose of doing like striking civilians with drones when they can destroy like hundreds of tanks or even aircrafts, like air bases? Because those drones are I wouldn't say they're I wouldn't say they're small. Well, if you look at the movies, compared to the movies like Angel Has Fallen, I don't know if you've seen the drone attack scene with the small, when there's a bunch of drone swarms attacking the president and the Secret Service agents. Like, I wouldn't like, and I've seen some mini footage of drones getting shot, and they're quite noisy. And I was wondering if why are they not using that during the night and always during the day? So maybe that's because of the technological advances. I've seen there were some footage of Ukrainian tanks, armored vehicles getting destroyed, but right now I don't see any progress with that. I haven't been following the wars recently. So maybe at the beginning, if they used it, the outcome could have been slightly different, but not a major impact on the war. And yeah, I would say I agree that it's a waste of money attacking electrical grids. Instead, they could have just targets on military infrastructures or other armor vehicles or aircraft. Maybe they could have been advanced more.
Yeah, I mean, there's always a problem with a weapon that can be whose main countermeasure is just cheap chicken wire from a hardware store, right? If you put up a net, the drone's going to get stuck in there. Now, if you have a heavy drone coming in at night, regardless of the technology, it's just a lot easier to do target identification during the day. So there's that cost, not cost, but significant reduction in efficiency. Like I think we have an agreement. There is an infatuation with visible technology in the press, and I mean, drones are awesome for videos, but for combat, if they've got full access to net-centric warfare, meaning they got a lot of intelligence guiding it into a target, then they can be jammed. And the Russians did inherit very broadband, high-powered jammers, which are operating on the front, and those are interfering with most of the Ukrainian drones. If you have an autonomous drone, then it's not going to be much smarter than a human being. At which point, you're dealing with a 20 IQ robot, which is going to hit all sorts of stupid things. And you could certainly have very, very intelligent people designing expensive robots, but then the country's going to waste money and ultimately lose the war. I mean, one of the big mistakes the Nazis made during World War II was the V2 rocket. The V2 and the V1 together absorbed 50% of all the explosives assigned to the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe at the end of World War II for almost no political effect. So you want to make sure that if you're taking people and putting them in a factory and not putting them in uniform, that they're compensating for their absence in the ranks. And these drones look, frankly, to me, like some contractors making a heck of a lot of money for questionable gain. Without, people need to do a cost-benefit analysis for those devices. Me, I'm a drone skeptic. I certainly, someone could chase me down the street with a drone, but if I'm operating under camouflage in a built-up area, they're going to have to spend a lot of drones to find me. And half those drones, with me jamming and me putting up chicken wire, they're going to be very easily stopped. A very, very important question, Yeha, because people will be drawing lessons from the war and spending a heck of a lot of money on what they think were the lessons. And the end of the Gulf War in 1991, because one Scud missile had hit an American barracks, killing 1/3 of all the American losses during the war, which were pilots sleeping in their beds and ground crew sleeping in their beds. The U.S. Pentagon spent a disproportionate amount on missile defense. If Saddam Hussein had fired 1 million Scud rockets at that same building, statistically, he probably would have hit only one. In other words, people became distracted by a piece of technology, and it led to wrong conclusions and a giant waste of money. And I think drones might be that. So thank you, Yeha. So Houston, I see you have your hand up.
Sorry about that.
Tell us what's on your mind.
We've been having a very interesting discussion about Wunderwaffe, as you were mentioning, and the utility of shiny new toys. And I think the point I was trying to make was that tanks weren't revolutionary, tank tactics were. So like having a plan for it is more important than what you have. But to get away from maybe like the particularities of like military technology, I kind of have two related questions that are kind of more broad and geopolitical, like why, like on the question of why wars happen and when they happen. First off, for the beginning of the war, and then a second one for the end, do you think that Putin took the Afghanistan withdrawal and his relative success in Syria, among other things, as evidence of his capabilities and the lack of will on the part of NATO forces to intervene further? Do you think that was part of his factor or his thinking? And for the probable conclusion of the war, which most likely will be a Russian defeat of some sort, in my opinion, if Russia is seen to have been defeated either through some sort of regime change or simply having lost, like the best case scenario, a defeat would be simply having lost everything that they attempted to gain in Ukraine while losing hundreds of thousands of people in potentially. Do you think that will cause a series of wars in the region where Russia seems to be retreating out of its imperial ambitions? So, for example, in Moldova or Syria or Georgia or Armenia, Azerbaijan, these are places where Russia has set up a status quo that could be upset by a defeat of Russia.
Yeah, great questions, Houston. So starting with what Putin learned from what Russia did in Syria and the collapse of the regime in Kabul. Yeah, I think there is a recurring phenomenon where authoritarian leaders actually don't know recent history. There's no question the democratic leaders, because they're essentially business-funded people with the leisure to get involved. And there's no question, every single newspaper and every political party writes policy that has a huge impact on corporate members of each state. And those people are heavily involved. So people in business don't like wars, fairly obviously. And because they have relatively unsophisticated thinking, they want to avoid wars. So democracies look weak. And you see that in it goes way back to Pitt the Elder in the lead up to the Russian, Habsburg and French attack on Prussia, to Pitt the Younger's mobilization against Napoleon, to the Foreign Secretary Grey not mobilizing England in the First World War early enough, to Neville Chamberlain in the lead up to World War II. Neville Chamberlain's dad owned a screw company that at the end of the 19th century controlled 40% of the world's market share. So this guy was a business person. He wanted to trade with Germany. Germany was one of England's larger trading partners in the lead up to the First World War. So of course these guys are desperate to avoid war. And if the English were able to avoid war with Germany in 1870 in the Franco-Prussian War, and World War I showed that it was a horrible mistake to get involved in the World War, why couldn't the British avoid World War II as well, right? Just give Hitler what he wanted in terms of principles of self-determination, and then nothing would happen. So Putin is looking at Europe and going, these guys are weak. And you know what? I on a certain level, he's right. But democracies, once mobilized, because they're able to make allies with other democracies very, very easily, more easily than any other type of political system, because they already have lawyers that deal with a lot of the interaction. You end up being attacked by an overwhelming coalition of angry democracies. So he should have known that. He didn't know that, but it's not his fault, because all authoritarian leaders make that one single mistake once, and then they suffer obviously huge retribution and a huge penalty, and they never forget that lesson. Yeah, Houston.
On that point, I think he was thinking in terms of the Cold War and their interventions in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, but even then, his thinking was stupid. They had the Soviet Union went into Czechoslovakia with 3 times the number of soldiers that they did in the Ukraine. They did not have a fully hostile government, and the population of the Czechoslovakia was something like 1/3 of what the Ukraine is today. So even based off of this, he was in a fanciful world where he had somehow brought overwhelming numbers when he just didn't. But yeah, that's just one aside. It seems like he's in a fantasy world where his capabilities or what he could send was simply far greater than what he had.
Yeah, there is a clock ticking against his regime that wasn't ticking against the government of Brezhnev. Brezhnev, of course, intervened in Czechoslovakia at a time when the West probably had conventional inferiority, so they didn't want to provoke Russia. Plus, you had West Berlin as a hostage. That meant that the West had to be restrained in every crisis, because the Soviets could always isolate West Berlin. The US's foreign policy, as I mentioned in the lecture, is to deal with Russia before China goes for Taiwan. And this is a paramount goal. So the Americans are being tempted by regime change. That's really the main driver here. There was an episode in 1990 during the confrontation with Saddam Hussein, where the US Secretary of State, James Baker, was sent by George Bush Sr. and they met at Geneva, and Tariq Aziz was the Iraqi foreign secretary, and James Baker gave him an ultimatum in the form of an envelope, which was leave Kuwait or we will bomb you. Now, what did the Americans want? The Americans were praying that Saddam Hussein would refuse the letter. If the Iraqis had pulled out of Kuwait, they would have preserved their military force. So the moment Tariq Aziz said no and publicly, visibly refused the ultimatum in the form of a letter from James Baker, the Americans could go to the UN, mobilization, even the Egyptians and Syrians sent a division to Saudi Arabia to attack Iran. That's the moment we have here with Russia. Putin gave America an opportunity to put their military in a vice, wear them down, and inflict regime change. And Putin didn't see it coming. I mean, it's remarkable. He didn't see that he was being set up. Now, I have to say, I've had a lot of students from countries like Iran and China, and the number one explanation they have, which is in the historiography of these better educated members, is they know the Americans are on the prowl, because the Americans are a liberal democracy. But liberal democracies are violently hostile to authoritarian states, not only for power reasons, but also normatively. It's easy to mobilize people when the people you're looking at are illiberal. Like illiberal, all Iranians vote. Iran is definitely a democracy, but it's an illiberal democracy. And so the Americans were able to justify their acts against Iran. So Putin, I mean, going back to your original question, Putin, I think he did learn that NATO is weak over the failure in Kabul, and the use of gas in Syria and the lack of Western response. On the other hand, frankly, an afternoon 10-minute discussion with any diplomat in the foreign ministry, and Putin clearly dictates. He does not listen to people. He's your typical Saddam Hussein, an authoritarian leader. And although he has very, very large meetings, it's very likely he has an incredibly small cabinet. And the cabinet that he has is actually just Siloviki, ex-KGB. And they act as a filter between him and the actual cabinet. And so having a very, very small cabinet, he doesn't have full information. And the difference between Syria and Ukraine is that the Americans have a lot of very, very fearful frontline NATO states like Poland that want war. Poland doesn't want to get into a war, of course. What they want is to give Ukraine whatever the hell it wants in order to wear down the Russians. Because if the Russians win in Ukraine, they're on to Poland next. And so Putin should have calculated that. In Syria, frankly, you have the Israelis. They're the only ones who really have a strong incentive to limit Russian benefits to the Syrians. And so he learned the wrong lessons. Your other question or point, which was about the likelihood of wars, I actually don't think you're going to get a war in Europe. There's no claim on Russian territory. I don't think the Finns actually want Karelia back. I think there'll be two states. Either Russia liberalizes, at which point the Finns could probably just go into Russian Karelia and buy a cottage, or they're going to be hostile, at which point they can't get in because Russia is an illiberal, anti-Finnish state. You might see ethnic cleansing in the sense of forced deportation. When the Warsaw Pact collapsed, Bulgaria deported illegally 150,000 Turks. You could see Estonia deporting tens of thousands of Russians back to Russia, which frankly is not a good thing. Eastern Europe cannot forever be as closed off and conservative in its social and immigration policy. It's just not compatible with the rest of Europe. You're going to see fissures within the European Union if that happens. So I don't see violence in Moldova. I see a quick change in government. I don't think Transnistria is going to lead to ethnic cleansing. For the Russian Far East, I do see that. I could see China go for a land grab. Vladivostok, Khabarovsk, Irkutsk, probably not farther west than Irkutsk, but then it becomes a very different game. The Japanese will go for the Kuril Islands. And I wrote an article on this. I think the US will intervene on behalf of Russians, and it'll be justified on the basis of civilization, but it's essentially a racist policy. But the geopolitical goal is not to let the Chinese have an Arctic waterfront, because any land acquired by China will give it longevity into the post-climate change environment. Under current circumstances, climate change is going to dry up the Himalayan glaciers that feed the Yangtze and Yellow River and will ultimately cripple China's ability to become a great power. If China gets the Yakut region, for example, it'll have access to a taiga that'll retreat. So it'll have soil. So it'll in effect be able to reinvent itself in the same way that Canada is in the future. And America does not want that. So I think the Americans and the Canadians will intervene with the Japanese in Russian Siberia in the same way that the Canadians, my army unit, 4th Field, or rather 16 Field Squadron, or was it 4th Field Squadron, intervened in Vladivostok. My regiment in Montreal intervened in Vladivostok with the Americans and the Japanese all the way up to Irkutsk to keep the Chinese or anyone else from taking Siberia. So that might happen. And that could bring the Chinese to blows against a Western coalition. But I don't see a lot of, I mean, I could see the Turks and the Persians having brief clashes in the Balkans, not the Balkans rather, but in the Caucasus. But right now there are 9,000 NATO troops that are planning an exercise in Armenia, despite the Russian presence there, and the Russians can do nothing to stop it. And so that's peaceful. If the Americans can get into Armenia through the Black Sea, through Georgia, and they can't be stopped, then that's going to have a significant break on Turkish sponsorship of Azerbaijan, for example, or of Dagestan, or of Chechnya. And I think the Iranians have a large constructive role, despite the fact that they have antipathy with Washington. They have fairly good relations with Europe. And so Armenian influence in places like France is going to lead to the Iranians ensuring that any collapse occurs in the least violent possible way. And it also benefits them because Iran obviously wants to limit the power of Azerbaijan. It has good relations with Armenia, and it would like to get more influence in Dagestan, Chechnya, and of course continue good relations with Georgia. What do you think, Houston?
I think the real risk is, I would say that I think NATO's commitment to Armenia is very minimal, honestly. I would say that war is more likely to continue because of deep animosity between those two peoples and nations. So I think that's, like, you mentioned a lot of states that are currently not in a state of violence or a state of war. So you're mentioning like the Far East and the North. My two main takeaways would have been Syria and Armenia, Azerbaijan being the most likely flashpoints, where the removal of Russia as a force would free up Turkey's hand and probably lead to conflict on both accounts with Iran, in my opinion. So Syria is the most likely location for further conflict because right now there's something of a stasis, but Turkey is looking to advance into the country and sort of push the Syrian refugees that they currently host out into that territory. And they also view the Kurdish population in Syria and the ideological alliance that exists there as a deep existential threat. So that's probably where war is going to continue. But a lot of people kind of skip over that in favor of the situation in the Ukraine. But I think that's going to be a significant flashpoint. That's my opinion.
Yeah,
I'll keep it short.
I think you're completely right about Syria. I think you're quite right. You're going to have a political vacuum, and Turkey is going to carve up a significant part of Syria permanently. And they're going to have international support because Syria is not able to get allies. And frankly, Iran doesn't have the reach to intervene effectively on Syria's behalf. And so Syria is left to essentially its own devices.
Yes, and my issue with that is the Western forces made an alliance with the Northern Alliance in Syria, essentially. I'm not going to get into it, but basically they're a far left ideological feminist group, which worth everybody looking up. That organization is on its death knell because the Western allies basically used them to defeat ISIS and then bounced, which I think is going to be it's going to have long-term consequences for people who pay attention to this sort of thing. Like, the Western allies are not actually long-term partners.
No, I mean, I definitely, I mean, there's sort of several issues there. The first one is it is important to have a liberal foreign policy, but at some point, power factors overwhelm it, and the Kurds are very, very difficult to save, just because they're treated with such hostility in Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran. And in order to access them, you have to sort of tunnel your way through one of those weak regions, and it's just very expensive to do. So unfortunately, the Americans are not powerful enough to save the Kurds. So it's obviously difficult. The other issue, of course, is the Kurds. I mean, they were, of course, they're left wing because they received a lot of help from the Soviet Union over many, many decades. And so in some ways, it's reasonable. I did see a Turkish training video, which looked like a communist international. I mean, they were referring to bourgeois classes. This is like 10 years ago, like 2010. I mean, so I didn't know that bourgeois classes still existed, but that's the kind of training. But we're not going to criticize the Kurds because on liberal values like the mass mobilization of women in the armed forces, they're frankly more liberal than many Western countries. Obviously, because they're desperate for manpower, they'll put women in uniform with guns. It's a little bit peculiar, but I don't think that's going in the wrong direction.
And I would sort of add to your analysis here that it's worth considering ideology of the actors as an important factor. For example, in this case, if the West is looking for long-term partners, this doesn't fit into the, I guess, capitalistic impulses of the West, but it does fit into the more liberal and democratic impulses of the West. So like Saudi Arabia is the complete antithesis of that because they fit in well with the capitalist international impulses of the West, but they do not at all fit into the democratic or liberal ones. So it's more than just like a practical measure. They've been having women soldiers for decades in that movement, and it's also worth considering that the Kurds themselves are not like one unit. So like in Iraq, the Kurds are essentially like a nationalist conservative and sort of clan-based organization around the Barzani clan, but this is more of an ideological movement fathered by Öcalan, I think his name is how he's pronounced his name. So it's worth considering like the ideological differences of partners, especially. But yeah, I'm gonna stop hogging the time. I'm gonna shut up from now on.
No, no, you're not hogging the time at all. You're quite right. It is the perpetual dilemma in Western countries to find out how to balance the liberal impulse in foreign policy with power requirements, and sometimes the trade-offs are heartbreaking. The collapse of the Warsaw Pact in about 7 days was a very clear indicator that Soviet occupation was completely immoral by Western standards, but there was nothing NATO could do to roll back communism without the acquiescence of the Soviet Union. You just can't save people that are liberal all the time because there's not enough power. It would be nice to liberate North Korea. It would be nice to save Hong Kong, which overwhelmingly does not want to be occupied by China. It would probably be the tactical, logical thing to do to put boots on the ground in Taiwan, but that would be very, very provocative. The Western powers are numerically a minority, even if they have overwhelming nuclear military capability, which is not really fungible for humanitarian intervention. And so there's simply not enough power in the West to save all of the promising liberal movements in the world. And sadly, very often those that get the backing are a function of sort of visual lobbying in the West and not done on the basis of meritocracy. And it also means that countries have to, in the West, democratic countries, have to make painful alliances with countries that treat their people very poorly. And this is definitely the case for a lot of the Persian Gulf oil exporters. It's difficult. So I mean, very good points, Houston. Leila Maria.
Yeah, just a very short point. I just want to drop back on what you said about like the whole climate change thing. Remember our paper for the national defense? There's this one point that I find that the United States doesn't really exert that much influence anymore there in that area, just for a simple reason that it can't really stop those smart Chinese industries from actually colonizing the Irkutsk area or all the way to the Arctic. Like they just can't. And if they will, or if Japan wants as well, then it's going to have to implement policies that's going to restrict the economic prosperity of that region. So that's a conflict in terms of the economy. But at the same time, it goes back to Russia because they're on Russian land to start with. And so Russia's doing really badly economically. So why would Russia even implement these policies to restrict, those growing Chinese companies in the region? And now with their whole friendship treaty, then there's not really much that the Americans can do apart from spending, what do you call it? The whole media stuff where the whole memes about how the Russians and Chinese are bad. That's the only thing that they could do. That's the only influence that they can exert in that area. And the Saudis are involved in that region too right now, with growing exports in the Irkutsk region all the way to Kamchatka, I think, as of recently. So yeah, that's my.
I do remember your policy paper that you wrote for the Department of National Defense that then became a call out for more papers on the same subject. So you created a trend. Obviously, it matters. I mean, for Canada's Arctic security to find out what's going on in the Arctic of the world's largest country that we obviously have overlapping interests with in the Arctic. And your what I would describe as sort of neo-colonial analysis of China's corporate influence in the Arctic, Russian Arctic, is a lot more sophisticated than what I was saying. I was describing a Chinese land grab. What you're describing is the normalization of Chinese commerce in the region that could have huge political impacts. What you're describing would circumvent what I was describing, which is you've got this Russian barrier between China and Yakutia, and the Chinese, frankly, could bypass it by establishing ports in the Arctic, which would be available in the summer, and commerce could then be, localized that way rather than through the nail network that runs through Irkutsk on its way to Mongolia and China. So yeah, I mean, you're quite right. That's probably the bigger variable. And so if China were to do a land grab, it wouldn't have to drive from China. You could just put people on a boat, go around the Arctic, and then. But to my knowledge, at the moment, we don't have large ports in the Arctic that extend out of Yakutia, and all that infrastructure, it goes to the Sea of Okhotsk, but 90% of that infrastructure connects back southward onto the main Trans-Siberian Railway. But if you look at the scale of Chinese infrastructure construction of ports in the South China Sea and on the coast of Africa and Hambantota in Sri Lanka, obviously with some modification because of the cold temperatures in the Arctic, I think we could see very large construction efforts by the Chinese that could conceivably create ports with capacities that are matching the Russian port facilities that are both to the east and west of the Ural chain of mountains. So I think you're quite right. That's a much more important variable than what I was identifying. The infrastructure construction based on economic interests versus a essentially aggressive land grab.
Yeah, but
sorry, Leila Maria.
Canada's development in the Arctic right now is far more advanced than the Russians and the Chinese to start with. So Canada probably will have better ports before the Russians and the Chinese. So either the Chinese pass by Canada and then make their way on, or it's going to be this kind of battle of who makes the fastest and biggest ports there. So that's like one thing too. But,
we do have first mover advantage, and we do have a highway that extends from the Trans-Canada up to the Arctic Ocean in the Yukon. We have that advantage. But the Chinese poured more cement in the 20 years between 2000 and 2020 than the rest of the world did in the entire 20th century. So they could catch up. Certainly, the Chinese poured more cement than Canadians have poured cement in our entire history. So the value of their infrastructure, not their annual GDP, but their actual sunk infrastructure, is worth multiple times their annual GDP. And I don't think we'd be able to compete against that. So the Chinese could invent an infrastructure quite quickly, I think. Abel.
Yeah, Professor. So I was thinking about it, and maybe what could be the chances of a second Cuban Missile Crisis at this point? Because obviously there's Cuba, the United States and Russia, their relations are really deteriorating because of the war in Ukraine, right? So perhaps if in some scenario could Russia want to station nuclear weapons in Cuba as a means to deter Ukrainian American support in Ukraine? Obviously, the problem may seem more nuanced. I mean, even regarding whether Cuba really wants that, but I'm wondering what would, if this is a real consideration or not.
I think Cuba. I mean, this is my guess is that the Russians would definitely suspend their earlier agreement with the Americans. So the 1968 Non-Proliferation Treaty was essentially an agreement by Russia to support not giving nuclear weapons to other communist states in exchange for the Americans not giving West Germany its own nuclear weapon, because the Soviets were terrified of a German nuclear weapon. So, and this lasted because of this irrational Russian concern about the Germans. If the Russians had seen politics from the perspective of other countries like the UK or France, they would have recognized that that England and France's objections alone would have been sufficient to keep the Germans from getting the bomb. But the Russians didn't recognize this. The Soviets didn't recognize this. So they made this deal with the US. Now, Vladimir Putin sees his country in decline, but he still hasn't started sharing nuclear weapons technology. I wrote an article about a year ago trying to explain that the reason Iran doesn't have the bomb is the Russians don't want them to have the bomb, because the Russians are benefiting to some extent by those type of non-proliferation arrangements. If Russia gave Iran the bomb, they're concerned that America might give Ukraine the bomb. Now, I don't think the Americans would give Ukraine the bomb, but for different reasons. So if Putin saw his regime as coming under greater threat, I could definitely see him divert some missiles to Cuba. I think it's plausible. I could see the U.S. if they find out blocking it at sea, but it's more likely you're going to get a submarine with nuclear missiles, cruise missiles. So not a Delta class or a Buleva class, which are the ballistic missile submarines, but an attack submarine like an Akula equipped with a nuclear cruise missile, like the Americans are deploying in South Korea right now. And so that type of sub would be very difficult to stop. Having a freighter armed with medium-range ballistic missiles, I don't think that's going to happen because there's nowhere to put them. Cuba doesn't have the road system that allows for mobile systems, and you don't want to build a silo off the coast of Florida because the Americans will blow it up with a conventional system. I think the concern in Havana is the Americans at the end of the Cold War had a neocon resurgence, which was partly motivated by those staff members that experienced the US defeat in Vietnam and therefore got a sort of revenge agenda. And so no surprise, after Saddam Hussein was defeated in 1991 and his forces ejected from Kuwait, the Americans started coming up with excuses to get revenge on enemies. And this included Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen, any country that had ever associated itself with the Soviet Union became a target. So I think Cuba is fearful of that. I think Cuba over time is normalizing its behavior. And while it might benefit in terms of military aid from Russia because it's forcing a confrontation with the US, I think Havana is also very conscious that in the long term, they have to get along with Mexico and the Dominican Republic and Colombia. And so most of their diplomatic effort is going to be focused there. And I think Mexico and Colombia wouldn't welcome Russian missiles in Cuba. So that's my guess. What do you think, Abel?
No, I think what you said really makes a lot of sense, right? Perhaps the only, I mean, what you said is what is more likely to happen, I think, but it's just because of the current economic crisis in Cuba and the lack of oil. Maybe they'll prompt the regime in Cuba to even act more irrationally as a means to keep support in the island. But that's my it's just a and very unlikely scenario.
Yeah, to be honest, I didn't know there was a crisis in Cuba, Abel, but I suspect, I mean, as you might have been seeing in the news, one of the largest investors now in Venezuela is the US, right? So Venezuela is being resuscitated, and the Americans have given significant concessions, and the Americans have started their covert public diplomacy against the Venezuelan regime in exchange for Venezuela exporting oil to US allies. Right, so this is the, I mean, the Americans have made a trade-off. The sort of virulent anti-socialists in Latin America and foreign policy in the US have been neutralized. And so what I suspect is going to happen is Venezuela is simply going to provide subsidized oil to Cuba, and the Americans will not object. So I think whatever Cuba is experiencing is temporary. Now that Venezuela is a key American ally. So good point, Abel. So I think that those are all the questions.
Yes,
So,
sir.
Khaled, I'm going to thank the PSGSA for giving me this opportunity to right a wrong.
Anytime,
And,
Professor.
And to revise a article I wrote that was clearly completely wrong.
There's also Layla from JPA and SDS and the Canadian Center for Strategic Studies. She was essential for all of this. So I would also really like to give her thanks for this. So thank you everyone for showing up. Thank you, Layla. Thank you, Professor. Have a good day. And yeah, it was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.